In 93 AD, a Jewish historian working for the Roman Empire wrote a passage about Jesus of Nazareth. And buried inside that passage, or rather buried in what that passage used to say before someone altered it, is a silence so specific, so deliberate, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The silence is about a father. I've spent 6 months on this, and what I found has been sitting in academic footnotes for decades, waiting for someone to be willing to say it out loud. I'm going to do that today. There's a passage in a first-century Jewish history book that most seminary professors will not assign to their students. It was written in 93 AD by a man named Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish historian working for the Roman Empire, and he wrote the longest surviving account of Jewish history from the ancient world. His book is called Antiquities of the Jews. It runs to 20 volumes. And somewhere in the middle of Book 18, there's a passage about Jesus of Nazareth that has been quietly causing scholars heartburn for about 300 years. Now here's the thing. Most people who have heard of this passage have heard of it in one form, the version you find in standard translations today, the one that calls Jesus a wise man, says he was the Christ, and describes his resurrection as real. Scholars call it the Testimonium Flavianum. It reads almost like a confession of faith, which is exactly the problem. Josephus was a Jew who spent his entire life defending the Jewish tradition. He wrote for a Roman audience. He never converted to Christianity. He never described himself as a follower of Jesus. And yet this passage, sitting right in the middle of his secular history, sounds like it was written by a committed Christian theologian. It wasn't, at least not originally. The first scholar to look carefully at this and say something was wrong was Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the 4th century, which is particularly odd because Eusebius is one of the people we suspect of helping to alter the text. And earlier than that, Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, references Josephus multiple times and explicitly states that Josephus did not believe Jesus was the Christ. But the passage we have today says the opposite. Someone changed it. The mainstream scholarly consensus, and this is not a fringe position, this is what you'll find in peer-reviewed journals, is that the Testimonium Flavianum is partially interpolated. Someone inserted words, phrases, perhaps whole sentences into Josephus's original text at some point between the 3rd and 4th centuries. But here's what most people don't follow up on. If someone added to the passage about Jesus, what did the original passage say? John Meier, who spent his career reconstructing Jesus as a historical figure stripped of theological overlay, offered the most cited reconstruction. He suggests Josephus wrote something brief and factual, something like, "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. He was one who did surprising deeds, a teacher. And when Pilate condemned him to the cross, those who had first loved him did not cease to do so. The tribe of Christians, named after him, has still to this day not disappeared." That's probably close to what Josephus actually wrote. Notice what's missing. No claim that Jesus was the Christ, no mention of resurrection, no statement that he rose on the 3rd day, and one more thing is missing: his father. Because there is a second passage in Josephus's work that mentions Jesus. It's in Book 20, and it refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. This passage is generally accepted as authentic. The scholarly debates focus on the Testimonium, not this second reference. But for our purposes, the critical point is this. Josephus, writing in 93 AD, names Jesus, names his brother James, but says almost nothing about his origin. I've spent 6 months working through every English translation of the Antiquities I could find, cross-referencing with the Greek critical editions available through academic databases. And what kept striking me is that the silence around Jesus' paternity in Josephus is itself a kind of evidence. Josephus was meticulous about lineage. He identified people by their fathers consistently throughout the Antiquities. To introduce someone without a named father was unusual. In some contexts, it was a social statement in itself. Stay with me on this, because what I'm about to show you has been buried in academic footnotes for decades, and I think it's time it came above the surface. About 2 years ago, I was on a flight to Frankfurt. I'd been invited to sit in on a lecture series at a conference on Second Temple Judaism. Not as a participant. I want to be clear, I'm a retired history teacher from Knoxville, not an academic, but a colleague of mine who knew about my research had passed along the invitation. I almost didn't go. The flight alone was more than I usually spend on anything. But I'd been reading a pre-publication manuscript that had been circulating in biblical studies circles. The author was James Tabor, a scholar I'd been following for years, and the core argument in what would become The Lost Mary, his 2026 book, was something I couldn't put down. I remember the specific moment. I was somewhere over the North Atlantic, 35,000 feet up, holding a printout that was already covered in my own pencil notes. And I got to the section on a name. The name was Pantera. The name. I'd seen it before. Anyone who has spent time in rabbinical literature from the first few centuries has seen it. The Talmud references Jesus occasionally, and in some passages it refers to him as Yeshu ben Pantera, Jesus, son of Pantera, or in some versions, Ben Panthera. The Christian tradition always treated this as an insult, a Jewish slur playing on the Greek word Parthenos, meaning virgin. The idea being that Jewish critics were mocking the virgin birth by saying the father was actually a man named Pantera, which sounds like Parthenos backwards, sort of. But Tabor's argument, and it stopped me cold on that plane, is that this interpretation is almost certainly wrong. Here's why. If the Talmudic sources were inventing a slur, they chose a remarkably inconsistent word to do it. The sound shift from Parthenos to Pantera doesn't work smoothly in Aramaic or Hebrew. It requires multiple assumptions about linguistic transmission. It's the kind of explanation that sounds plausible until you work through the phonology. And more importantly, this is what Tabor documented in the manuscript I was reading at 35,000 feet. The name Pantera was real, attested in the Jewish world of the first century, not a slur invented by critics, a name that people actually had. The evidence for this came to light through an archaeological discovery that had been available for years, but hadn't been synthesized properly. An ossuary, a bone box, the kind used in Jewish burial practices during the Second Temple period, was found in Jerusalem with an inscription that read, Joseph Pentheros. Pentheros is the Greek equivalent of the Semitic Pantera. It means something close to father-in-law or patriarch. It was a term of family honor. So Pantera was not an obscure Roman name. It was not a slur invented by critics. It was a name or a title or a family designation that was present in Judea in exactly the period we're discussing. I sat on that plane looking at my notes, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time in my research. Not exactly excitement, more like the feeling you get when you're following a trail and the trail suddenly becomes clearer. When what looked like a dead end turns out to be a door. The question is, whose door? Because if the name Pantera in the Talmudic sources is not a slur, if it's a real name that real people had, then we have to take seriously the possibility that the tradition was recording something. A memory, a claim, maybe a true one. And there is a second source older than the Talmud that makes the same claim. His name was Celsus. He wrote in approximately 177 AD, roughly a century after Jesus' death. His book was called The True Word, and it was a systematic philosophical critique of Christianity. We don't have the original. It was destroyed by the church. But we know what it said because Origen of Alexandria wrote a lengthy refutation of it around 248 AD, quoting it extensively in order to argue against it. In Origen's Contra Celsum, Celsus is described as making the following argument, that he had spoken with a Jewish interlocutor who told him that Jesus' mother Mary was a poor spinner who had been seduced and impregnated by a Roman soldier named Panthera and had been cast off by her betrothed husband Joseph when her pregnancy was discovered. Celsus is writing in 177 AD. He attributes this account to a Jewish source. He is not inventing it, he is citing a tradition that was already circulating, one that his Jewish interlocutor apparently knew. That means we have, independently of each other, a Talmudic tradition and a 2nd century Greco-Roman source both preserving the same claim, that Jesus' father was a man named Panthera. Now, who was this man? In 1859, a construction crew working near the town of Bingerbrück in what is now Western Germany made an unusual discovery. They were digging along the bank of the Rhine near the old Roman settlement of Bingium, and they found something that had been buried for 18 centuries. It was a gravestone, made of limestone just over a meter tall. The inscription was military in style, Latin, and it named the man buried beneath it, Tiberius Iulius Abdes Pantera, from Sidon in Phoenicia. An archer of the first cohort of Sagittari who served for 40 years, died at age 62. The stone is now in the Römerhalle Museum in Bad Kreuznach, Germany. You can go see it. It's not disputed. It's not a reconstruction. It's a real physical object that has been examined by epigraphers, archaeologists, and military historians for 160 years. His name was Abdes Pantera. Abdes is a Semitic name, Aramaic or Phoenician, that means something like servant of God. It was used in the Syrian and Phoenician-speaking world. Pantera is the family name, and he was from Sidon, a coastal city in what is now Lebanon, which in the 1st century was a major port in the Roman province of Syria. Sidon was within 2 days' travel of the Galilee. Let me walk you through the chronology, because this is where it gets forensic. The inscription tells us Pantera served 40 years in the Roman military and died at age 62. Working backwards, and Roman military historians have done this work, he would have enlisted around 22 BC and died around 40 AD. He was in active military service at the turn of the era, around the year 6 BC, which is the range most scholars assign to the birth of Jesus. Pantera would have been in his 20s or early 30s. That is, young, mobile, and stationed somewhere in the Eastern Roman world. The first cohort of Sagittarii was a Syrian auxiliary unit. Syrian auxiliary units routinely rotated through postings in Judea and the Galilee during the reign of Herod the Great. The unit later appears in records as stationed in the Rhine region, exactly where the gravestone was found, after being transferred from the east. Auxiliary units raised in the east would serve in the east, then rotate to frontier provinces. Standard pattern. Which means, around 6 BC this man, an archer from Sidon with a Semitic first name and the family name Pantera, may well have been stationed in or near the Galilee. He ends up buried in Germany, a long way from Sidon, a long way from Galilee. Now, I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming here. I am not claiming proof. Neither is Tabor. Neither is any serious scholar who has looked at this evidence. What we are claiming is that the convergence of evidence is too specific to be coincidence, and too consistent to be dismissed as slander. Think about what we have. A Talmudic tradition naming Jesus' father as Pantera. A 2nd century Greek source naming a Roman soldier called Panthera as the father. An archaeological ossuary proving that Pantera was a real Jewish family name in Judea. And a military gravestone proving that a man named Abdes Pantera from Sidon was a Roman soldier in active service in the Eastern Mediterranean at exactly the time and place in question. These 4 data points came from 4 completely different directions. They were not compiled to prove a predetermined conclusion. They emerged separately from different linguistic traditions, different archaeological sites, different historical periods. The standard scholarly response to this kind of convergence, when it points somewhere uncomfortable, is to raise the threshold for evidence. Correlation is not causation. The name Pantera was common. The chronology doesn't prove proximity. All technically true, none as powerful as they sound. Because when you apply that same skeptical standard to the gospel accounts of Jesus' conception, when you ask for the evidence behind the virgin birth, the evidentiary bar disappears. Faith is invoked. Miracle is invoked. The conversation stops. That asymmetry is what drove me to spend 6 months on this. A man who lived and died in 1st century Judea deserves to have his history examined with the same rigor we apply to any other figure from that period. The same rules, no exceptions. And right now, the most rigorous historical examination of the available evidence suggests that Jesus' father may have been a soldier, a Sidonian archer, a man named Pantera. The name was carved in stone 18 centuries ago, and it's been sitting in a museum in Western Germany this whole time. James Tabor's book is not primarily about Pantera. That's important to understand. The Lost Mary is, at its core, about Mary herself, about recovering her as a human being with agency, with her own history, with circumstances that shaped her life in ways the gospel narratives were not designed to preserve. The book emerged from decades of Tabor's excavations, most of it centered on the Talpiot tombs in Jerusalem. And what the 2026 book argues, carefully with citations you can follow up on, is that the dominant way of reading Mary's story has systematically erased the possibility that she was anything other than a passive vessel. I want to tell you about a conversation that changed how I read this. A few years back, I was at an archaeological site near Caesarea Maritima. I'd taken a detour on a trip, this was before Tabor's book came out, just to see the Herodian Harbor excavation that I'd been reading about. And I got to talking with an archaeologist who was working the site. She was not a biblical scholar in the theological sense. She was a dig archaeologist, interested in ceramics and stratigraphy, the kind of person who thinks in layers of soil. I asked her something that had been nagging at me. I asked her, when you dig and you find something that contradicts the historical narrative you started with, what do you do? She said, and this has stayed with me, she said, the dust doesn't lie. The dust just sits there until you decide you're ready to look at it. Tabor's argument about Mary is exactly that. He's not saying the church lied. He's saying the tradition made choices, and those choices removed certain possibilities from view, and what's left in the dust, in the archaeological record, in the rabbinic sources, in the 2nd century texts, is the outline of a woman whose story is far more complicated and more human than 2,000 years of theology have allowed. Here is what the evidence, assembled carefully, suggests. Mary was young, possibly very young, in the range of 12 to 14 years old by ancient standards, which was not unusual for betrothal arrangements in 1st century Judea. She was betrothed to a man named Joseph, and something happened either before or during the early period of that betrothal that resulted in a pregnancy that Joseph had not initiated. The Gospel of Matthew records that Joseph, discovering the pregnancy, intended to divorce Mary quietly, not to expose her publicly. This is actually a significant detail that most people read right past. If Joseph believed the child was divinely conceived, if he believed an angel had explained everything to him, there would be no reason to consider divorce at all. The divorce consideration, even the private one, is a trace of a historical reality that the narrative is struggling to contain. Tabor's reading is not that Mary was victimized in a simple sense. His reading is more nuanced, and I think more honest. He proposes that Mary may have had what he calls a secret marriage, or a legitimate union, by some legal standard of the time, with a man whose identity was subsequently suppressed because it was, from the perspective of the later Christian movement, embarrassing or dangerous. A Roman soldier, in occupied Judea as the father of the man who would become the central figure of a Jewish messianic movement. You can understand why that would be suppressed, but suppression is not erasure, and what Tabor documents is that the suppressed information left traces in the Talmudic tradition, in Celsus, in the ossuary evidence, in the German gravestone, in Matthew's curious detail about Joseph's decision to divorce quietly. The traces point in the same direction. And here is the thing about Mary that Tabor's book argues most passionately. If Pantera was real, if this union happened, then Mary was not a passive recipient of divine will. She was a young woman in a specific social and political situation who made choices or had choices made for her, and who carried the consequences of those choices for the rest of her life. She raised a son who would reshape the world under conditions of social stigma and family complexity that the gospel accounts have systematically smoothed over. That is not a diminishment of Mary. That is a restoration of her. And I found it, sitting with that archaeologist's words in my head. The dust doesn't lie. It just sits there until you're ready to look. I think for most of Christian history, the institution was not ready to look. There is a third layer of this story that most people who know about Pantera have not fully engaged with. If we accept, even as a working hypothesis, not as established fact, that Jesus' biological father was a man associated with the Pantera name, then we have to ask what that means for the rest of his family lineage as it appears in the historical record. The Talmud preserves several references to what it calls Yeshu ben Pantera or Yeshu ben Panthera. Some of these references are almost certainly polemical, products of Jewish-Christian debates in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, where the son of Pantera claim was wielded as an argument against the virgin birth. But some of the references appear to be earlier, and they have a different texture. They don't feel like polemical invention. They feel like preserved memory. One of the passages in the Jerusalem Talmud, and this is in the tractate Shabbat, refers to a healing performed in the name of Jesus ben Pantera. This is remarkable on its own terms. It's evidence that early Jewish communities preserved the Pantera patronymic not only as a slur, but as an identifier used in actual practice. People invoked the name. That means the name was considered within some Jewish communities as the real name of Jesus's family lineage. John Dominic Crossan, who spent his career trying to reconstruct the historical Jesus from the ground up, has written about what he calls the social world of Jesus. Part of that social world involved the profound stigma in 1st century Jewish culture of being mamzer, a term for someone born outside of a legitimate recognized union. The status of mamzer was serious. It carried legal, religious, and social consequences, and it was, in the world of 1st century Palestine, essentially inherited. It didn't go away. What Crossan and others have argued is that Jesus' known social behaviors, his association with people considered unclean, his hostility to the temple hierarchies, his explicit statements that the last would be first, make biographical sense if Jesus himself had grown up on the wrong side of a social stigma. Not as a theological statement, as a lived experience, a man who knew what it was to have his legitimacy questioned, who went out of his way repeatedly to eat with the people respectable society, had declared outside the circle of acceptability. That biographical reading doesn't reduce Jesus, it explains him. It connects the ethical core of his teaching to a specific social position he occupied from birth, through no choice of his own. And one more piece deserves attention. The Pantera name, if it was a real family name, as the ossuary evidence suggests, may have named a family network, not just an individual. Ben Pantera may have meant of the Pantera family, locating you within a specific kinship structure. If that's true, the tradition was not necessarily naming a single soldier. It was placing Jesus outside the strict Davidic genealogy that the Gospel of Matthew worked so hard to construct. Matthew's genealogy contains 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, all of them women whose sexual history was irregular by the standards of the tradition. The genealogy is doing work. It is managing a problem. And the problem has the outline of a real paternity question, not a theological one. Josephus knew. The Talmudic rabbis knew. Celsus had a source who knew. The German soldier's gravestone is sitting in a museum in Bad Kreuznach, with the name carved in stone for 18 centuries. The history was always there. It just required someone to be willing to read it. I need to be honest with you about why this matters to me. I'm not doing this to tear anything down. That's not what I've been trying to do on this channel, and it's not what I'm trying to do here. I spent 50 years in Southern Baptist churches. I taught Sunday school. I sat with families in crisis and helped them find words from Scripture that gave them something to hold on to. That's real. That mattered. The faith that those communities carry matters, even if the institutional history of how it was constructed is something else entirely. But here is what I keep coming back to. The Jesus that most Christians are presented with is a figure who stepped into history from outside of it, without a real mother in the full human sense, without a biological father in the historical sense, without the social entanglements and stigmas that every other human being has had to navigate, already divine, already separate from ordinary human life. And what I've found, spending 12 years in libraries and databases and academic journals, is that the historical record points towards something different, something harder and stranger and more interesting. A woman, young and probably frightened, in a complicated social situation in Roman-occupied Judea. A man, a soldier, possibly from Sidon, whose name was Pantera, and who may have been the biological father of a child who would go on to reshape the world. A family that carried a stigma, that navigated exclusion, that found in the religious and social margins of first-century Palestine a space to exist and eventually to speak. And a teacher who emerged from all of that, not despite it, but because of it, with a message that kept finding the people who had been told they didn't belong. I'm not sure what to do with all of that theologically. That's not my job. My job, as I understand it, is to find what the sources say and share it, as honestly as I can. James Tabor's work, Josephus's ghost of an authentic passage, the limestone gravestone in Bad Kreuznach, the Jerusalem ossuary, the Talmudic references, Celsus's testimony, they don't add up to proof. I want to be clear about that. They add up to something that demands serious attention and careful thought. They add up to a human being, a real one, with a real history. And I find that more moving, not less, than the alternative. That's the truth of it. Make of that what you will.